Hi everyone, we are looking at 2020 Post-Bacc Econs H2 Question 1b. Discuss the factors that the Singapore government would consider when deciding if intervention to lower the price of fuel such as petrol is necessary. Okay, firstly, if you have decided that this question is about arguing whether the Singapore government should intervene or not intervene in the market for fuel, then your thesis and antithesis will be slightly off, right? The point of this question is about the factors that they will consider and not so much arguing why they should or shouldn't. Okay, I think that is a common misconception that students have when they view such questions about the Singapore government and intervention, but then there's this new added word called the factors that they consider. Okay, so just bear in mind if the question is asked in this way, discuss the factors of something or an economic agent, if they should do something, right? That should be ultimately a decision-making framework kind of question, right? If not, the question would be phrased as discuss if the Singapore government should intervene or not, right? And that's a slightly different question that you should answer. Okay, so with that in mind, discuss the factors that the Singapore government would consider. So what are the factors of the decision-making framework? I think that should be something that you know by now, that ultimately, right, the factors are always the same factors, right? Economics, we only consider things like the benefits, the costs, and the constraints, right? These are usually the three main ones that we can talk about. Others are things like my unintended consequences or the information that is provided. But in this case, I think it would always be good to start with the benefits, costs, constraints, right? You will not always get question decision making regarding the economic agent as the Singapore government. Sometimes it would be the decision of an individual, like a consumer, or sometimes the question could be the factors that a firm would consider, right? Then that would change the way you talk about the benefits, costs, and constraints. But regardless of which economic agent, the framework always talks about these three factors. Okay, and then we just tailor it according to the economic agent. But in this case, we are talking about the Singapore government. So what is their intention to lower the price of the fuel? It would always be good to understand the government's perspective first. What is the objective that they want, right? And then we can later on argue on the significance of each factors. So in this case, the Singapore government, why would they want to intervene in a market such as petrol? Right? When we talk about the intervention in certain markets, we always talk about society's welfare, or sometimes government intervention linked to society's welfare is that the outcome must be equitable or efficient, or sometimes the Singapore government or any government intervenes because of some macro goals, right? So perhaps petrol and the price of fuel, it's a particular market, but because it's such an important industry that impacts many other industries, perhaps the goal could also be macro related. Okay, but we won't talk all our points about our macro goals, right? It's just something that you could consider as part of your benefits cost constraints. Okay, so this question is about detailing and explaining the different benefits, the costs, and the constraints. And then what would be our evaluation? Our evaluation is arguing, right? Which of these factors that we have explained, which bear a greater significance? And after weighing, what should the direction of the Singapore government be, right? That's where you're going to get your evaluation points. Okay, so in this case, what are some possible benefits that we can talk about? So when we talk about intervening for equitable outcomes, efficient outcomes, macro goals, right? We can think about consumers, firms, and the economy. So some of the explanation can revolve around how consumers will benefit from the lower prices of petrol. Could it be in terms of the markets that they are engaged in, such as business and leisure travelers? Or could it be in terms of cheaper public transport prices? Right, those are consumers. Right, we can also talk about the benefits to firms, right, who use fuel or transport forms a major part of their costs, right? And it talks about how it increased their profits due to lower cost of production. We can also talk about how the impact is on such a wide scale because it impacts so many industries. We can also link to some macro goals of the economy, right? Could it help to increase the national income, right? As so many producers are affected, perhaps there could be some effect on the SRAS as well. So these are the range of benefits that you could talk about. Right? What about the cost? Right? Generally, the cost is quite easy concept to understand. At the very basic part of it is what are the costs of the policy. Right? So the government, in deciding to implement or to intervene in the market for price of fuel, they need to consider how much it costs them, right, to lower the price. Of course, it is not clear how they want to intervene, but to lower the price of fuel, one possible way could be in terms of the subsidies. So the cost would be the amount of subsidies that they give, right? That is one possibility. It could also be in terms of the opportunity cost, right? In implementing these subsidies to lower the price of the fuel, what are some benefits in other areas of society that they might have to give up on, right? Those are opportunity costs, and you can also consider them as costs. So the cost of the policies are the explicit costs, the opportunity costs are the implicit costs. But in this case, we also know that the cost could be on the oil companies, right? Would it affect their profitability, right? Would there be a cost on them? Right? Again, this is more related to how the Singapore government intervenes. If the government intervenes by implementing a maximum price, right, then oil companies' profitability will be affected. But if it's a subsidy, then may not exactly apply here. So you need to consider that the costs on the oil companies are dependent on the way that the government intervenes. That's the slightly difficult part. Okay, and the last part, the constraints. What are some possible constraints that they could consider, right? So, of course, the constraints, the easy one to talk about is, does the government have enough budget to even implement a policy such as a subsidy, right? So, um, the larger the cost, the more the constraints will be, of course, depending on the amount of reserves. Right? The constraints could be also in terms of the reliability of information, right? How do they know how much to subsidize? What will be a good price to lower the fuel to, right? If they were to implement subsidies on petrol companies, right? Would would these subsidies be passed down to consumers, right? So they need information about that, right? But if we know the petrol companies in Singapore, right, those are oligopolies, right? So even if you implement some sort of a subsidies, will it trickle down to the consumer? So you need to consider whether the government has enough information about the market structures and the cost structures of the petrol retail industries. Again, more information of the content and the examples are in the suggested answer where you can refer to, right? Today, My goal is just to break down the question for you. Right, then what would form our evaluation? Right, so our evaluation in this case is to argue, right, which is the most significant factor. Or you can also argue how certain factors are not as significant. For example, the constraints of the government budget may not be that great, knowing that Singapore has such a huge amount of reserves. Or you could argue that the government budget is very significant, especially in times of COVID-19, where a lot of other economic priorities take greater weight at the current moment. Right? The evaluation could also be you weighing the costs versus benefits, right? And how could we do so, right? Could it be in terms of the short run costs versus the long run benefits, right? Um, which outweighs which, right? So instead of just saying the government should do this if benefit outweigh the cost, that's like very duh, right? This is like so obvious, right? You should be weighing the costs and benefits in this context. Do you think that they should? Is it necessary that they implement? So it's not only about actually the question says discuss the factors, but they also requires you to weigh the factors and give a good opinion or judgment on whether they should uh, intervene in to lower the price of fuel or not. Right? Other factors you can consider. What is Singapore's priority at the moment? Right? Is this important enough market to intervene in this particular times that Singapore is facing? Right? If it shouldn't be a priority, then you can also argue that perhaps now the cost might outweigh the benefits and it's not so good for them to intervene, or the constraints is just too much that they cannot even consider, they should not, right? So any judgment that helps you answer why one factor is more significant, or any judgment on why they should intervene or not intervene, will be considered evaluation in this type of questions. So for this kind of questions, right, how would we structure our answer, right? It's usually the same. The only difference is that in your intro, right, what is the economic agent's objective, right? If the question is about a firm's decision, then we will talk about profits. If it's about a consumer's decision, then we will talk about maximizing satisfaction. But in this case, we are talking about the government's objective, right? Because the economic agent presented to us was the government, Singapore government, right? So we would consider that they want to maximize society's welfare, equitable, efficient outcome, and macro goals, right? And then you'll move on to your second paragraph, which is the benefits, right? Which we already talked about on top. And then your costs, right? Again, the costs, we're always going to talk about benefits and costs, but how you tailor it depends on, again, I stress, the economic agent. If it's from the firm's perspective, then things like benefits would be how their revenue will increase, right? So whether the country, you must be careful what economic agent is the question asking you about, right? And then in your next paragraph, you could talk about the constraints. Again, tailor it to the economic agent. And lastly, your last paragraph would be your conclusion, right? Which is your reasoned judgment. What is the most significant factor? Are there other information that we need to consider in light of all these benefits, cost constraints that we have debated about? Right? Why would this be more or less a constraint in Singapore's context? Right? All these arguments would be in your conclusion or sometimes peppered along the way, but helps you make a final judgment on the decision that they should make. Okay, so that's the end of this question where there's some important things that we learn. Firstly, number one, which economic agent are we looking at? Number two, what is the decision, right? In this case, the economic agent is Singapore government. The decision is lower the price of fuel. Factors, there are always benefits, cost constraints, but we tailor them to the economic agent. So thank you. For more information about how the answer can be written in prose, please look at the suggested answers which are uploaded. Thank you.